Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Okar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that March is the month of women's history. So it's an opportunity to acknowledge and recognize and celebrate the contributions of women, past and present, in our field and beyond. With that in mind, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Redmond Chang today, who is going to be with us and who is not only an accomplished and distinguished scholar herself, but also she's going to talk about her most recent publication that explores three queens in the 16th century. Dr. Redmond Chang, thank you so much for being with us today and accepting our invitation.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak.
Of course,
What I'm
it's a
going to talk,
pleasure.
yeah, should I go ahead?
Of course, yes, the
Okay.
screen is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Um,
Right.
what I'm going to talk about today is the book that I published in 2023, Young Queens, Three Renaissance Women and the Price of Power. Now, the first thing I should say is that I wrote this book for a non-specialist audience. So for people, particularly women, who were interested in history, but who were not scholars themselves. I did want to do a good deal of work in terms of feminist ideas, but on the other hand, I also wanted to tell a good story about women and a story that felt both epic and intimate. So, what I'm going to do today is briefly summarize the book and talk about the feminist approach that I took. Secondly, I will explain how I came to write the book. And third, I will go into how the conditions of writing the book might have helped me make it both more intimate and more feminist. So let me first share my screen. I have just a couple of slides. Um, Hopefully you can see that. Yes. Um, these are the queens. It is a group biography. Young Queens is a group biography. And the narrative follows the intertwined lives of three 16th century women who happen to be queens. So that was actually very important to me, is to really talk about them almost as women first, queens second. But of course, you can't entirely divorce the two. So who were these women? They are from top to bottom. If you look at the title page or the cover of the book, Catherine de' Medici, who was the queen consort of France. She's the consort because she's the wife of the French king, Henry II. When Henry II died in 1559, Catherine became the queen mother of France when her oldest son, Francis II, ascends to the throne. When Francis dies and Catherine's second son, Charles IX, ascends to the throne, Catherine became the regent of France, although that position was actually unofficial. Even so, she is the power behind the throne, and she remains the power behind the throne pretty much until the rest of her life. Now, the second queen is Catherine's daughter, Elizabeth de Valois. Elizabeth was Catherine's oldest daughter, not her oldest child, but her oldest daughter. At 13, Elizabeth married Philip II of Spain and so became the queen consort of Spain. And this marriage marks the end of the Italian wars that had been raging between France and Spain for generations, off and on, but for generations. Because her marriage marks the end of the war, she is known as the Queen of Peace. Elizabeth died from complications of pregnancy when she was 22 years old in 1568. But before she died, I think it's clear that Catherine was grooming Elizabeth to become something like a perpetual ally of France in the Spanish court. At the same time, Philip II he was clearly in love with Elizabeth. And by the time she died, their marriage had actually gotten quite strong. So Elizabeth had found herself in the position of balancing allegiances to her mother and to her husband and to France and Spain. It was a very tricky position. The third queen in the story is Mary, Queen of Scots, who was probably one of the greatest political failures of the 16th century. That's certainly how most people know her. And they also know her as the cousin of Elizabeth I of England. What many people forget is that Mary was the queen consort of France for a very short period of time. She was Catherine de' Medici's daughter-in-law when she was married to Francis II. Mary was raised in France from the time she was 5 years old. Effectively, she is a French woman culturally, certainly linguistically, and also she's very French in terms of her relationships. Elizabeth de Valois and Mary are very close childhood friends. They're raised together, and in many ways, they're raised like sisters. Mary is 3 years older than Elizabeth, and I would say she was the bossy older sister, and that was a power dynamic that Elizabeth de Valois never entirely forgot. So those are the queens, and I'm just going to advance the slide here. There we go. I wanted to show these other pictures of the three queens because they are not the ones that normally we see, in whatever capacity. These are not the images that we normally associate with these women. But these were the images that I tried to keep in mind in my head as I was writing this book. So on the left, you have Catherine as a young mother. She's actually pregnant in this portrait. It's not as apparent here on my slide, but her gowns are very loose. And that's how we know she was pregnant. So this is her as a young mother. The middle portrait is of Elizabeth de Valois when she's about 13. And this is the age that she was when her marriage to Philip II was contracted. And the last portrait on the right is of Mary, Queen of Scots, when she was 5 years old and when she had first come from Scotland to France. And Catherine de' Medici actually commissions this portrait of Mary soon after she arrived. So these were the images that I tried to keep in mind as I was spinning out this narrative. I'm going to leave this slide up for the rest of the talk. There are no other slides, but just so that you have a visual. So in the book, these queens start their lives together in France and then fan out to different kingdoms, France, Spain, and Scotland. The narrative weaves among them and among those different places. Sometimes I foreground one of the queens, sometimes another, but what I really wanted to show was that they are part of a larger, holistic story. Now, because the book is a narrative, it has a plot and a chronological arc. It's a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The plot begins in 1519 when Catherine is born, and it ends in 1568 when Elizabeth de Valois dies. 1568 is also the year that Mary, Queen of Scots, flees Scotland for England, where she's imprisoned by her cousin, Elizabeth Tudor. By 1568, Catherine is mired in the French Wars of Religion, which had been going on and off for several years, since 1561. And those wars would continue long after Catherine dies well into the 17th century. So the book doesn't end on a happy note. But that is actually one of my points. What I was trying to show is that on some level, it was extremely challenging, even horrible, to be a young queen in the 16th century. And so I think it's fitting for the book to end on a low point. Now, as I said earlier, it's not a scholarly book. Young Queens doesn't have a proper scholarly argument per se. I would say that the intervention it makes is in my approach to the material and in how I told the story. I knew when I started the project that I wanted to write a woman-centered feminist history. But of course, that could mean many things. Feminist history can take on many guises. So what I found useful was to set myself a guiding question that would function as my pilot as I conducted the research and as I wrote the book. That question was this: if my reader could only read one book about these women, what would I want it to contain? And how would I want that story to be told? how would events look if I told them from the point of view of these women? If I somehow was able to put myself in their shoes. It's not a novel, so I couldn't use the first person, of course, and I certainly couldn't make things up, but I did try to privilege a woman's perspective as much as possible, to favor their voices and to look at things that maybe they would have cared about as women. Viewing close to that female perspective helped me evaluate which sources to use, to decide as I was putting things together into the narrative, what would rise to the surface and then what would fall back. So to give you an obvious example, anything that had to do with childbirth or menstruation or female adolescence, that really came forward. Granular details about battles, fell backward. Now, I have to tell you that viewing close to this woman-centered perspective, I actually found that to be quite a challenge, because once I decided to do this, I saw how often that doesn't happen in a lot of the secondary literature. Certainly with scholarship, we tend to take a more sort of neutral voice, but I think that that neutral voice ends up sort of skewing towards a male perspective. Now, for my readers, I wanted them to dive into the plot, but I also wanted them to consider another set of questions. What was it like to be a young woman living adjacent to the seat of power? How were young royal women both powerful and powerless because they were women? What kinds of experiences did these women share? And what does that say about the experience of being a woman in the 16th century? Even though Catherine, Elizabeth, and Mary belonged to different generations and ultimately landed in different kingdoms, they do face very similar challenges because they were women and because they were young. So the book works on 3 levels. First, I was tracing the biographies of the 3 women. Second, I was intertwining those biographies to tell a more meta story about what it was like to be young, female, and royal in the 16th century. And third, in some ways, I think these queens show us on an even higher level what it means to be a woman in a patriarchal political system. Now, when it came to biography, I was invested in developing a character-driven story. That meant that I wanted the book to explore the human qualities and inner lives of the female protagonists to the extent that I could, to the extent that the archive would allow me to do so. Who were these women, really, as people? Why did they make certain choices? What were their lives like behind the scenes? What did they feel on the inside? What did they love or hate? What did they fear? What were they really good at? And also, what were their flaws? I really wanted to write about their flaws. Now, I did have what's called the biographer's dilemma. I got very attached to all 3 of my queens, but I wanted to write about, where they fell a little bit short, because creating a complex and rounded picture of these women was, in my mind, a key part of the feminist project. That was particularly true when it came to Catherine de' Medici. I thought it was really important to capture complexity with her because she's so often demonized, and I wanted to humanize her. So I sometimes get asked, who is my favorite queen? Actually, I get asked that quite a bit. That seems to be a favorite question among podcasters. I like them all for different reasons, but I have to say that Catherine is my favorite queen. And when I first started this project, I harbored a secret desire to exonerate her, to free her from this serpent queen image that she seems to carry around. I like Catherine so much that I actually had a hard time writing her death. And in the first complete draft, she didn't die. She just kept on living. But then my editor explained that readers were going to want to know how it all ended for her. So I did end up writing, including her death, in the epilogue. But if you go to the epilogue, you'll see that after I explain her death, I then go backwards to a scene and a time when she's still going strong. And that's how the book ends. I think I like Catherine so much because she's incredibly resilient. She's savvy, but she is also very flawed. And because she lived for a long time, there are many historical moments where we can investigate all that complexity. I should say that I've lived with Catherine for a very long time, over a decade. She was the first queen that ever really intrigued me. I didn't actually start off my career writing about queens. I started out as a history of the book person. I worked on print culture and gender. But as you know, if you do any work on the French 16th century, you are going to come across Catherine. She's just everywhere. She kind of haunts, the 16th century, especially in the second half. Once I started to focus on her as a research topic, that's when I saw how she had really been reduced to a very negative stereotype in the secondary literature, pretty much until, I would say the last 50 years or so. In fact, I think there's no such thing as an objective or neutral account of Catherine. She inspired very strong feelings in her own time. People either adored her or they despised her. And I think that continues to be the case. She's incredibly polarizing. And, that's not that different than female politicians today. But as I started to look closer at Catherine, I could see how, how she didn't start off as that evil stereotype. If anything, she was kind of kept on the outside. She was Italian, a commoner, and a Medici on her dad's side, but she also descended from French royalty on her mother's side, which is a detail that many people don't know or they conveniently forget. In France, she was both a foreigner and not a foreigner because she was a Medici, but at the same time, she was actually related by blood to the French royal family. So it was Catherine who made me aware of the straddling of loyalties and identities that was expected of so many queen consorts. There is a way in which queen consorts are always a little bit foreign, and their gender only amplifies that foreignness. Now, Catherine was married, as I said, to Henry II, but Henry wasn't always the heir. He was a second son. And for a little while, Catherine seemed destined to live a kind of marginal life at the French court. And I think had Henry not become the heir and eventually the king, she wouldn't really have shown up too much in the history books. She became less marginal, certainly as the queen consort, but even at that time, she was mostly preoccupied by motherhood. So Catherine only really steps onto the political stage as a widow. What's remarkable about Catherine's story is that from relatively humble beginnings, she then becomes one of the most important political players in all of Europe. That passage from court nobody to global powerhouse makes a really fascinating story, but just at least in sort of the common mindset, people seem to want to flatten her into this serpent queen, this evil queen, and that had been going on since the 16th century. Why did that happen? And how did that happen? To answer those questions, I ended up writing with a co-author a study and translation of several 16th century texts by and about Catherine to understand the public face that she developed in the 16th century. And that was my first step in getting to know Catherine better. Young Queens, I think, is a second phase in that project. But this time I was interested in fleshing out Catherine's experiences specifically as a woman. So if the earlier book was about sort of Catherine's public face, with Young Queens, I wanted to find the woman who was behind the public-facing queen. It was while working on that first translation that I stumbled upon Elizabeth de Valois, Catherine's daughter. I knew nothing about Elizabeth, which actually surprised me because I had been working on women for a long time and I had never really encountered Elizabeth in the secondary literature. But it was clear from the letters that I was translating that Catherine had written to Elizabeth that Catherine thought Elizabeth was very important politically. And it was also clear to me that Catherine deeply loved Elizabeth. So those letters showed me the human side of Catherine, but they also provoked a question. If Elizabeth was so important to Catherine, why had history forgotten about Elizabeth? So that was the other spark for the project. I wanted to bring Elizabeth de Valois back into the conversation. Mary entered the picture naturally, thanks to what I was working on in the archives. I realized that she was a part of this story on one of my first research trips to Paris. I was working in the Arsenal library on a 19th century edition of the notebooks kept by Catherine's ambassador to Spain, the Bishop of Limoges. And those notebooks contained a number of letters that had been written by Elizabeth, Catherine, and their diplomatic circles between 1560 and 1561, which is during the reign of Francis II. So Catherine's in France, Elizabeth's in Spain, and they're writing to each other. Some of those letters were written in what was clearly cryptic language. They weren't in cipher, but the language was deliberately vague. And they kept referring to this gentleman, le gentilhomme. They kept talking about this gentleman, but would give no details. And I sat there, I was baffled. You know, who is this gentleman that they keep talking about? And it took me a couple days until I finally figured out that they were talking about Mary, Queen of Scots. So by that time, I knew enough to know that Elizabeth had been raised with Mary and had been quite fond of her as a child. But now it seemed that Catherine and Elizabeth were plotting with each other about Mary. And, you know, I wanted to know how that happened. So this was a case of the archive showing me the heart of the story, the relationships and the themes and the conflicts that would eventually structure the plot. That set of letters ended up being the core of the book. If you read Young Queens, they're there in part 3, pretty much as I found them in that library all those years ago. For the rest of the book, I just followed where that core set of letters was pointing me and built out the picture bigger and bigger. Okay, I want to move on now for the second half of my talk to talk a little bit more about what it was like to write a narrative history, one that privileged story as much as it privileged the research. Sometime last year, I was speaking at a conference, and during the Q&A, I said this sentence that I think holds true now. So I will repeat it here. And that is that Young Queens is not for a scholarly audience, but only a scholar could have written it. That I think is true. I stepped away from academia officially in 2017, but I never stopped being a scholar. You know, you can't. You can take the scholar out of academia, but you can't really take the scholarship out of the scholar. It just colors how we see our materials, kind of how we see the world. And to research Young Queens, I really did have to rely on my scholarly chops because so much of the material came from the archives. But when it came time to write the book, to actually compose the narrative, to structure the story, and especially to flesh out the characters, I had to shed my skin as a scholar and start to really think like a writer. I think that stepping away from academia freed me psychologically to do this. I don't think that that's the case for everyone. I think there are plenty of scholars who write, you know, excellent narrative history. But for me, I almost think I had to step away from academia in order to write a narrative like this. Remarkably, the other thing that freed me as a writer and that actually helped me with some of the research was the pandemic. So I want to talk about that. And I'll start with a story that actually has more to do perhaps with the research than with the writing. It's a story that I've never told in public before. You're the first audience. But it's about how, there might have been some silver linings to the pandemic, certainly for young queens. Now I have to acknowledge first that the pandemic was, horribly challenging. I was through the most of the research, but not all, when the pandemic hit. And like everyone else, I suddenly found all the archives closed. The Folger Shakespeare Library, which is right down the street from me, was closed both because of the pandemic and because they were doing a remodel. And that was particularly painful because so much of the secondary material that I was working with was actually available at the Folger. So like everybody else, I was using these digital archives like Gallica and archive.org and HathiTrust. But, it was maddening. I don't know about you, but I still kind of get this knot in the back of my neck whenever I think about all that scrolling that we had to do during the pandemic. I think it's because I didn't have the sources that I had been using, that I became very fixated on one particular source. That was a multi-volume biographical study of Elizabeth de Valois by a Spanish scholar named Amasua. Now, this multi-volume study is one of the few full-length scholarly treatments of Elizabeth de Valois, and I had already used it several times in various research libraries, so I knew what was in it. And as the pandemic wore on, I became absolutely convinced that I couldn't write Young Queens without this book. It's as if all of my anxiety just got really focused on this one volume. The problem is that it wasn't digitized anywhere. I finally found a copy on eBay. It was in Madrid, but there was something really curious about the description of the book. The description on eBay said that it had 5 volumes, but I had only ever worked with 3 volumes. I had never seen this in 5 volumes. So I thought that this was just, perhaps a mistake on the bookseller's part, which happens. And I thought, whatever, I paid my $200 and they packed up the books and they shipped them over to Washington, D.C. Well, when I unpacked the box, sure enough, there were 5 volumes. And I recognized the first 3 volumes, but I had no idea what the final 2 volumes were. Well, what they happened to be were appendices. They were the justificatory texts that the scholar had used to write his scholarly work. Basically, what they were 2 giant tomes of primary sources on Elizabeth de Valois. And actually, little show and tell, I can show them to you. This is one of them, and there were 2 of them that I hadn't been expecting. Primary sources on Elizabeth de Valois, many of which I had never seen before. And they, some of these primary sources really touched on stuff I was looking for. For instance, her day-to-day schedule, what she was wearing, the state of her health. So this was an extraordinary stroke of luck. And if it hadn't been for the pandemic and that strange fixation that it produced in me for this one work, I would never have found these extra volumes. They would never have, ended up in my hands. So this turned out to be a fabulous lesson in what many writers talk about, that the story finds you. Novelists say that the story finds you. And I would say that in this case, the sources found me. So it was a reminder that I had to trust the process. There were other ways in which the pandemic nudged my writing into a different place, in part because it jolted me out of my comfort zone, because the world had just gotten so strange. I was shut up in my house with my children, like everybody else, which made for a certain amount of chaos. But At the time, my children were all entering early adolescence or their early teen years. And I got the chance to watch that transition from early childhood to adolescence in a different way than I probably would have in normal circumstances. I could see up close that my children were holding on to their childhood, or at least parts of their childhood, in part because they were so stressed. They were children, but they were grappling with some really adult problems. And I think seeing that and understanding that helped me develop a different sensitivity when reading about 16th century children. I definitely think it made me more sensitive to the types of traumas that Elizabeth de Valois was dealing with. If you think about it, her world must have been shattered in 1559. She was 13 years old when she was sent to Spain that year. It was on the heels of her father's very violent death. She's married to a man 20 years older than her, a man who she had been raised to think of as the enemy. That was something that was an important realization for me, that Elizabeth had spent her whole childhood thinking of Philip II as a monster. And suddenly, alliances change, and just like that, she's set to marry the monster. Now, we know from letters written by Elizabeth's ladies in waiting that in the months after Elizabeth's arrival in Spain, she was really stressed. There were lots of signs. She was very melancholic. Um, she had odd hours for her sleep. She ate at odd hours too. She would snack indiscriminately, and she also played with dolls. Um, that comes from one line in one letter by a lady in waiting, but it really caught my eye, the fact that she was still playing with dolls. I really wondered about that. Was that a sort of regression into childhood? She was definitely dealing with a lot of major life changes. She had moved from one kingdom to another. She was learning a new culture and a new language. She now had certain sexual obligations, certain responsibilities as queens. Maybe the dolls were how she dealt with the trauma. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have paid as much attention to those dolls had I not been carefully watching my own children during the pandemic. But that little detail was a moment where all of a sudden I could visualize Elizabeth's experience in an entirely different way. At the same time, during the pandemic, I was becoming much more sensitive to the resilience of the women I was writing about, because we were all trying to cultivate resilience in the pandemic. And I think resilience is where Catherine de' Medici really shines. She dealt with some incredible challenges and always seemed to land on her feet. Uh, she had to deal with the humiliations of her marriage when her husband was in a very public relationship with a very powerful mistress. She dealt with 10 years of infertility as a young bride. She dealt with the deaths of her husband and young children and the volatile reigns, not only of one son, but of two, at least in the period that I was working with. She had to deal with ongoing civil war. Now, all of this did take a toll on Catherine, and you can see the human cost of that in her letters. But Catherine somehow was able to dig deep. She had incredible reserves of courage, and that's what allowed her to put on her game face. I think it's pretty clear in her letters that Catherine was trying to teach Elizabeth de Valois that same kind of resilience because it was such a political asset. And by the way, no one taught Mary, Queen of Scots, how to be resilient. And I think a lack of resilience is one reason why Mary fails so miserably. She never really could shift out of one political mindset and adjust to another. So what am I telling you? What I'm saying is that what was happening as I was writing is that I was letting the 21st century world the pandemic and its effects on my research and in my home, its effects on me emotionally, I was letting all of that color how I was thinking about the past. And this is the opposite of what we are trained to do in scholarship, in academia. For all the right reasons, we're trained to be dispassionate, to not put ourselves into the archive, into the text that we're looking at and reading. But now I was writing something different. I was writing a character-driven story about young women, and I needed empathy to write that way. And maybe I even needed empathy as a woman. So I allowed myself to think emotionally about the evidence. I do want to say that, I am still a scholar, so I was careful and critical about how much emotion I let in, and I did really strive to stay true to what the archive was showing me. But I think it was important to let those emotions into the writing process. As I'm thinking about it, I think there's a simpler way to put it. I think that often we let history in here, but we don't let it in here. And that's where I started to let it go. If I wanted to write a feminist history that put the reader into the lives and minds of the women I was writing about, I had to go into the lives and minds of those women first. I had to be the first one. I had to react in a human way to their stories and to try to get as close as possible to the material as if I were experiencing what they were experiencing. And once I did that, that is what I put on the page. So writing Young Queens really entailed letting go on so many different levels. I had to learn to trust the process. I had to sympathize with these queens in a very human way, one that flew in the face of my scholarly training. And then I had to trust that I could let these queens, these women, be who they were on the page. So I see I have a couple more minutes. I just want to close with one other point about, this idea of letting go, and why letting go is important to story, and how that when it comes to readers and the general public, uh, the story ends up becoming perhaps even more important than the ideas that you're trying to convey to them, no matter how much you work at it. So as a scholar, I had gotten very used to the idea of controlling my work. When I write scholarship, I can state my argument clearly. Not everyone is going to agree with me, I know, but at least they know what I'm trying to say. At least they understand the ideas that I'm trying to put forward. But it was a very different experience, or I should say, it has been a very different experience for me with Young Queens, because Young Queens is a story, even if it's a nonfiction story. And reading a story is an emotional experience for readers. By and large, I've been very lucky to have positive responses from readers, but I have sometimes been taken aback because readers like the book sometimes for reasons that I did not ever expect. So I try to stay away from Amazon reviews, but I sometimes do read them. And I was really surprised to find that one reader said that she enjoyed Young Queens because of all the scandal and murder and intrigue. And another one said that reading it felt like reading fantasy. So, for a little while, I thought maybe they had read a different book, that this wasn't the book that I actually wrote, because I thought I was writing about women and power, and, a female perspective and the female body and hybridity. But these readers didn't get any of that. Or, if they did, they didn't care about those ideas at all. What they cared about was scandal and intrigue and fantasy. And somehow that's what they found in the book. So I grappled with that for a little while. That was a little hard for me to accept, because I had worked so hard on the ideas. But in the end, I had to learn to accept that that's okay. Whatever the reader takes from it, that's okay. In fact, it's great. The story worked for them, even if it worked in ways I hadn't expected. And maybe scandal, intrigue, and fantasy were exactly what those readers needed at that moment, especially after the pandemic. Somehow, Young Queens delivered that for them. And if the story stayed with them, what I can hope is that on some level, the feminist ideas land with them too. So I'll stop there and I'd be delighted to take any questions that you have. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. It was a very sweet and also emotional talk at the same time. As a woman myself, I was already sympathizing with the characters that are in your stories, and so I am curious about your own academic background. But we do have a and how that contributed to in this project.
Mhm.
But we do have a question in the Q&A box. So with this, I'm going to start the question Q&A session, but I also would like to invite everyone to write their questions in the Q&A so I can read them to Dr. Redmond Chang. Elizabeth Fama asked, this is incidental, but in your research, did you uncover anything about the relationship between Catherine with Maria Salviati, Cosimo Primo's mother? I know there is one extant letter from Catherine to Maria, in parentheses, a letter that hints at a more extensive correspondence, and that Maria accompanied her to France for her wedding. Did you uncover anything more?
I don't think I've uncovered anything new. And no, I didn't. I know what you're talking about. There is some sort of correspondence, and Catherine clearly was close with her because I believe this is one of those cases where you're not gonna. I don't have perfect recall of exactly what happened, but I believe that Catherine does write to her on several occasions to express her homesickness,
Mhm.
and she may also have written. I know that was to somebody else. I was going to say she may have also written to her about clothes, but she does write to her about homesickness. So you're right. It points to a greater relationship, but I did not end up diving into that.
Okay, great. So now, my question, I do have some questions about your research methodologies and that, but then my first question is about your own background, because we did read in your short bio that you do have academic experience, right? You were an associate professor at George Washington,
Mhm.
in George Washington University. So I would like to know, not as like a personal question, but what happened and how did that background contribute to this in this project?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm an academic. I like I said, you can step out of the academy, but you're still kind of an academic. Uh, I was trained. I got my PhD in comparative literature, and I ended up teaching in a French department. I was a tenured associate professor. And then I moved abroad, actually, with my family to the UK, and I was there for several years. We did that for personal reasons, but I was already at a point where, for a few reasons, I was feeling the need to kind of step outside of the university and to leave the university and to try my hand at writing differently. Uh, you know, Again, I think you don't have to leave academia to write narrative history, but increasingly, I was really wanting to write for a much more general public and
Mhm.
to write in this very narrative way. And in some ways, I think that has always been with me. I've always thought of myself as a writer, or let me put it this way, the writing was always really important to me. I liked the research, but I really cared about the writing, how it sounded, how everything was structured. And at some point, I realized that I cared about the writing as much or more than I cared about the research, and that the research was in service to my writing. At that point, it just made a lot of sense for me to leave. We also thought, my family thought we were going to be in the UK for much longer than we were.
Mhm.
So that's another reason why we left, or I left.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
Right. Your academic training in
Mhm.
working at the archive, and analyzing the documents and the evidence that you find, they all contributed. So
Absolutely.
without being a scholar yourself, this project could not happen at all.
No, it couldn't have happened. And the other thing I want to say is that I do kind of wonder if my training in literature led me to this project rather than my training in history, because I was really a close reader. That was that was how I approached text always. I was always looking for small details. That's how I was trained in literature. And it was something that I
Mhm.
liked to do. So everything was always very micro. And that skill in looking really closely at very small details became really important to this project. Because even though we're talking about queens or royal women, there's a lot that isn't really documented or a lot that wasn't seen as very important. So it's easy to miss. But sometimes in these small details that you see in various letters or various texts, there's actually something sort of stunning or remarkable if you look closely and sort of sit with it for a while and
Mhm.
figure out, sort of how it's going to resonate and what it means to the bigger picture.
Right. Yes. So as you were writing this book, who was the intended audience? I know you explained it in the beginning of your talk that you had an image of your audience, but did it evolve at any point? And how did that influence your writing?
Yes, it's a great question because I actually think that as someone who was stepping out of academia, that was one of the hardest things for me was to figure out who I was talking to. uh, because I kept kind of wanting to talk to the scholars, even though I wasn't talking to the scholars. So my agent actually helped me a lot. She said, okay, Leah, try to imagine the women working in my office. These are really well-read women, but they're not scholars. They enjoy history, they enjoy nonfiction, but they also read a lot of fiction. And they're sophisticated, but they don't know anything about this. So that was very helpful to kind of have that idea.
Mhm.
The other person, that I had in my mind was my mom, because I would put her in that same category as being someone who's educated but not a scholar at all. And so that did help in figuring out,
Mhm.
what am I going to have to explain, and where can I have a light touch and maybe add less detail, and where do I have to unpack
Mhm.
more?
Right. This having less detail. This is
Mhm.
actually a perfect bridge to my next question, because you do talk about modifying your writing. So from a scholar intended audience to a public intended audience, right?
Mhm.
So you kind of work with writing. We're not talking about simplifying writing. We're
No.
talking about less details. And so how did this modification happen in your style?
Yeah, well, I would say fewer details on some things and greater details on other things.
Mhm.
That's the first thing. So I think that one of the first things to kind of debunk is that writing for writing for a general public is easy. It is not easy. I This is the hardest thing that I've ever written. It's my third book, and it's the hardest thing that I've ever written. Um, and when I first went into it, I thought, okay, shorten your sentences, make it clearer.
Mhm.
you know, uh, Subject, verb, fewer adverbs and adjectives, and that is all true. But the the most challenging thing and the most important thing is structure, right? Is
Mhm.
this narrative arc that I was talking about, so that the reader feels that they are on a journey, and that
Mhm.
journey kind of parallels the journey that the protagonists are going through. you know? So the protagonists are sort of in the process of changing, you know, over the course of the story. And your writing has to make the reader feel like they are experiencing that change themselves. And it happens through story structure. So that was the biggest difference, I think, for me,
Mhm.
versus writing in a scholarly way. And I think you know, again, I mean, we're all readers. We all read fiction. So we have a sense, you know, of how that works, I think, intrinsically. And I think even in my scholarship, you know, I was always going for that feeling of a certain kind of story arc. But here I really needed to have it, and it had to kind of mirror the chronology as well, you know, the sort of the beginning and the middle and the end. So, so that took a while. You know, I went through draft after draft after draft. I
Mhm.
probably wrote thousands of pages to end up, you know, where I did, because it was a learning process for me.
Of course, yes. You know, we just a couple of weeks ago we did have a talk on these topics and subject matters now being transformed into topics for other media like cinema or TV shows.
Mhm.
So, but then we did also talk about, you know, how fantasized the gaps were, you know. So even if it is based on some scholarly, you know, publications and writings, but then they fill the gaps where they
Yeah.
don't find the documents or they don't have the expertise to figure out how to fill the gaps in their scholarship, so they fantasize, right? Did you hit any moments that you had to fill the gaps, but as a scholar you took a different approach?
Um, Possibly. So I think with narrative nonfiction, there are two camps. There's the camp that believes that you can be creative and maybe do some of that filling in and make some stuff up here and there. And there's the camp that believes, no, you can't do that. And the art is in creating a story, even though you don't fill in the gaps. And I'm in that camp.
Of
um,
course.
you know, the challenge is, I just actually think it's more fun, you know, to try to do it that way. And you know, I think what you have to do is position the material such that the reader's mind starts to go where you want the reader to go. So that the reader is with you, and then they start to imagine or sort of fill in the gaps. I do think for women's history, and I see it a lot in popular history about women, by trained historians. Sometimes you have to say, we just don't know, you know, like
Mhm.
it's just not there. I think readers are really interested in that. And you can put that
Mhm.
kind of thing in a little footnote on the page. And readers are interested in seeing when there are these holes in the archive. And
Mhm.
that gives them a little bit of space to sort of speculate for themselves. So it almost becomes interactive. Readers like that, I think.
Of course, yes, and then you can also train your readers
Yeah.
to,
Mhm.
you know, to upgrade with you as the story, you know, gets like deeper in the narrative. But have you expected this text, your this publication, to be used in academia at all?
No, not really. That is a really good question. No, I don't think it necessarily lends itself to that. Although, you know, sometimes I think it's very helpful. When I was teaching, I found it very helpful, if students read a novel or watched a movie or something to give them a flavor of the time. And I think that this book could be used in that way, you know, with undergrads. So
Mhm.
that's not so much like scholarship, but more about teaching. Uh, I
Right.
think,
Yeah,
yeah, I think it could
I'm
have a role there.
asking this.
Mhm.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Because asking this because I'm just thinking, you know, so first of all, English is my second language. And then so when I started studying art history, I was lost not only in the language that art historians tend to use, right?
Mhm.
Which can be very sophisticated, and you lose the idea in the third word in a sentence. But at the same time, you know, long paragraphs, long texts, and complicated history, right? With
Mhm.
everything involved, right?
Mhm.
Politics. religion, culture, traditions, all of that involved. And as a student, even in my undergrad and even early, like the first year of my first master's degree, I was thinking, I wish somebody could just tell me what this is about. And then it took me a longer time to read the entire article or the entire book, and then I could figure it out. But I
Yeah.
still, like, after halfway through the article, I still don't know what they're talking about because I'm just so lost in the language, right? Of course, this is many years ago and things have changed for me, and practice makes it perfect. So things have changed. But that's why I was thinking something like this can be extremely helpful for beginners in academia, right?
Yeah. Well, just even to get a sense of the bigger picture, what is going on? And or if you're studying women in the Renaissance, how were they, what was their role? What was their political role? How were they used, deployed in political systems? I do think that those sorts of themes can be really useful as an entryway into the 16th century and into women's studies or, what have you.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So we have a second question by Mary Garard. Thank you for sharing your process and the shift in values or approach as you moved from scholar to storyteller. Inspiring. And I definitely second that. But there's no reason why good scholarship can't employ the same practices, engaging storytelling, attention to the choices faced by protagonists, especially women. I certainly aim for that in my own work. And so what are your comments or reactions to this?
Absolutely. And I think that um, you know, I was going to say the best scholarship. I actually don't think it's necessarily the best scholarship, but it's just another way of teaching. It's another way of reaching your audience. I think that there doesn't have to be a kind of binary between, storytelling and scholarship. There are many ways to do scholarship, and there are many ways to teach an audience, and they're all part of the same thing, and they actually have the same mission. So I completely agree. And I think that when I was doing more scholarship, I also was sort of aiming for the rhythms of story, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I find it more fun when I can write that way. So I definitely endorse seeing as much of that as possible in scholarship.
Of course, right. Yes. And so as I just looked at my watch and I can't believe we only have 2 minutes. This was a very sweet conversation. I felt like we're in a coffee shop having coffee and having a conversation. So it went by so fast and smoothly that I didn't even look at my watch. But I do have a question about the content of this book. How do you think that this book can um, complicate the traditional narratives about intersections of gender and public authority or political authority in Renaissance?
Well, maybe that's a huge question.
I know
No,
I should have asked it
no, no,
first. I don't
no,
know.
that's okay. I know. I just want to say it's a great question, but it's a huge question. But I think that I can get to an answer by talking very quickly about Elizabeth de Valois' menstrual cycle. Because it was in researching and writing this book that I realized how important it was whether or not this girl got her period. It was going to change the decisions that were made in various different courts in the 16th century. And that, not only was it important, but people around her understood that it was important. So one thing that you see, especially when you look back at, 19th century scholarship, for instance, until, practically, let's say, last couple decades, there is a sort of, dismissal of anything that has to do with, female bodies or these, so-called the private lives of these women. But what I am trying to say is that those female bodies and those private lives of those women were crucial to the politics of the time, and people knew
Mhm.
it. So in that sense, I do think it sort of shifts again what we consider important and unimportant.
Thank you so much. That was That was a very good answer in such a short time. The last question in the Q&A, could that possibly be the portrait of Catherine de Medici on your desk, or am I hallucinating?
No, that is. It is a 19th century engraving of her. Oh my gosh, that's
Right. So
wonderful.
Suzanne, you're right.
Yes, I mean it's the 19th century imagination of Catherine, right? Because we don't actually have one of her when she's quite that young, but yes, it is. It's Catherine because she's my
Wonderful.
favorite.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. This was a very sweet talk. I truly enjoyed it, every second of it. Thank you so much for being with us and accepting our invitation again. And of course, I want to end with this, that for those of you who observe and Ash Wednesday, wishing you a meaningful and blessed day. Also on Sunday, March 9th, daylight saving will happen in the United States. So please make sure that you are on time for next week's talk. It's going to be on 5 p.m. New York time anyway. So wherever you are around the world, please calculate your time. And I hope to see you all again next Tuesday. Same time, I can say on number, but I don't know what time it's going to be, depending on where you are around this globe. But hope to see you again next week, same time, same link. And thank you again, Dr. Redmond Chang, for being with us. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for inviting me. It was really a pleasure to be here for me.
Thank you. Pleasure is all ours. Thank you. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.